Saram students, today let us continue with the revision of history lesson number 2 from hunting gathering to growing food. In this lesson we will revise about domestication and a new way of life, and we will also revise about storing animals and finding out about the first farmers and herders towards a settled life, and a closer look, that is living and dying in Mehrgarh and elsewhere, that is about the cave paintings in France, and a Neolithic site, that is about Turkey. Now let us begin with the first topic, domestication. Children, what do you mean by domestication? The process in which people, they grow plants and they look after the animals. This is called as domestication. Very often plants and animals that are tended by people, how do they become? They become different from wild plants and animals. Why? This is because they select plants and animals for domestication. And we can take one example, that is they select those plants and animals that are not prone to any disease, and they also select the plants that yield large size grain and that have strong stalks. Why? So that they are capable of bearing the weight of the ripe grain. And seeds from selected plants are preserved and sown to ensure that the new plants and the seeds that will grow will have the same qualities. Children, which were the earliest domesticated plants? The earliest domesticated plants were wheat and barley. Amongst animals, those that are relatively gentle, they are selected for breeding. Children, which animals were considered as gentle? Sheep, goats, cattle and pigs. They were considered relatively as gentle. So these animals, they were selected for breeding. As a result, gradually domesticated animals and plants, they became different from the wild animals and plants. For example, the teeth and horns of wild animals are usually much larger than those of domesticated animals. Children, here in this picture we can see a set of two teeth. One teeth, it belongs to the wild pig, and the other, it belongs to the domesticated pig. So we can see and we can say that the teeth that is towards the right side, it belongs to the wild pig, and the teeth that is towards the left side, it belongs to the domesticated pig. And children, which were the earliest domesticated animals? The earliest domesticated animals were sheep and goat. And domestication, it was a gradual process that took place in many parts of the world, and it began about 12,000 years ago. How many years ago? 12,000 years ago. Virtually all the plant and animal produce that we use today, it is a result of domestication. Now let us revise about a new way of life. When people, they began growing crops, they had to stay in the same place for a long time. Why they had to do so? It meant that the people, they had to stay in the same place for a long time, looking after the plants, watering, weeding, driving away animals and birds, till the grain ripened. And then the grain, it had to be used carefully. And as the grain, it had to be stored. For what? For both food and as seed. So the people, they had to think of ways of storing the grain. So in many areas, they began making large clay pots, or they wove the baskets, or they dug the pits into the ground. Now let's revise about storing animals. Children, we know that the animals, they multiply naturally. Besides, if they are looked after carefully, Then they provide us with the milk, which is an important source of food and meat whenever required. In other words, we can say that animals that are reared can be used as a store of food. Now let's revise about finding out about the first farmers and herders. Children, if you see this map, you can see that each blue square, it marks a site from where the archaeologists they have found evidence of early farmers and herders, and these are found all over the subcontinent. So children, can you name some of the sites where the archaeologists have found the evidences of the first farmers and herders? Some of the most important ones are in the northwest and in present-day Kashmir and in East and South India. And to find out whether these sites were settlements of farmers and herders, what did the scientists do? The scientists, they study the evidence of plants and animal bones. And one of the most exciting finds, it includes the remains of burnt grain. So these may have been burnt accidentally or on purpose, and the scientists they can identify these grains, and so we know that the number of crops were grown in different parts of the subcontinent, and the scientists they can also identify the bones of different animals. Now let us revise about towards a settled life. Children, the archaeologists they found traces of huts or houses at some sites. For instance, in Burzahom, which is in present-day Kashmir, people they built pit houses which were dug into the ground with steps leading into them, and these may have provided shelter in cold weather. Children, what were pit houses and where have they been found? Pit houses were built by people by digging into the ground with steps leading into them, and they have been found in Burzahom. And archaeologists have also found cooking hearths. Where have they found the cooking hearths? They have found the cooking hearths both inside and outside the huts. And what does this suggest? Which suggests that depending on the weather, people could cook food either indoors or outdoors. And stone tools have been found from many sites as well, and many of these are different from the earlier Palaeolithic tools, and that is why they are called as Neolithic. And these include tools that were polished to give a fine cutting edge, and mortars and pestles were used for grinding grain and other plant produce. And children, mortars and pestles they are used for grinding grain even today, that is several thousand years later. And the Paleolithic tools they are continued to be made and used, and some of these tools they were also made of bone. And many kinds of earthen pots have also been found. These were sometimes decorated and were used for storing things, and people began using pots for cooking food, especially grains like rice, wheat and lentils that now became an important part of the diet. Besides, they began weaving cloth, that is using different kinds of materials. For example, cotton that could now be grown. So that time also cotton was grown, and in many areas men and women they still continued to hunt and gather food, and elsewhere people adopted farming and herding slowly over several thousand years. And besides this, in some cases people tried to combine these activities, that is doing different things during different seasons. Now let's revise the next topic, a closer look, living and dying in Mehrgarh. Mehrgarh, this site is located in a fertile plain near the Bolan Pass, which is one of the most important routes into Iran. and Mehrgarh. It was probably one of the places where people learnt to grow barley and wheat and rear sheep and goats for the first time in this area. Which crops did people learn to grow in Mehrgarh? They learned to grow the crops like barley and wheat. And which animals did they rear for the first time? They reared the animals such as sheep and goats for the first time in this area. And it is one of the earliest villages that we know about. The archaeologists who have excavated the site, they found out the evidence of many kinds of animal bones. Bones of wild animals such as the deer and pig, and also bones of sheep and goat were found. And other finds at Mehrgarh, they include the remains of square or rectangular houses, and each house, it had 4 or more compartments, some of which may have been used for storage. And when people die, their relatives and friends, they generally pay respects to them. People look after them, perhaps in the belief that there is some form of life after death. So, burial is one such arrangement. Several burial sites have been found at Mehrgarh, and in one instance, the dead person was buried with goats. Why? Because they were probably meant to serve those dead people as food in the next world. So the dead person was buried with the goats. Now let us revise elsewhere, that is about the cave paintings in France. Children, if you find France in your atlas book, you can see that this painting is from the cave, that is in France. And this site, it was discovered by 4 school children more than 100 years ago. And these paintings were made between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. When were these paintings made? These paintings were made between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. And who had discovered them? It was discovered by the 4 school children. And many of these were of animals such as wild horses, aurochs. What is aurochs? An older wild form of cattle. And bison, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer and bear. And these all, they are painted in bright colors. And these colors were made from minerals like ochre or iron ore and charcoal. And it is possible that these paintings were done on ceremonial occasions, or perhaps they were made for special rituals that were performed by the hunters before they went in search of prey. Now let's revise the next topic, a Neolithic site, that is in Turkey. Children, if you find Turkey in your atlas, you can see that it is one of the most famous Neolithic sites. And Katal Huyuk was found in Turkey, and several things were brought from great distances. That is, flint was brought from Syria, cowries from the Red Sea, shells were brought from the Mediterranean Sea, and these all were used in the settlement. And during that time, there were no carts. So most things would have been carried on the backs of pack animals, such as cattle or by people. Children, what was brought from Syria? Flint was brought from Syria. And from where were the cowries brought? Cowries were brought from the Red Sea. And what was brought from the Mediterranean Sea? Shells were brought from the Mediterranean Sea. Now let's have a quiz. Tick the correct option. First one, grains like wheat and barley have been found in dash. A. Koldeva, B. Mehrgarh, C. Mehrgarh, D. Hallur. What's the correct option? Correct. C. Mehrgarh. Grains like wheat and barley have been found in Mehrgarh. Second one, which was not a way of storing grains in the early days? A. Boxes. B. Woven baskets. C. Clay pots. D. Pits in the ground. What's the correct answer? Yes. A. Boxes. Boxes was not a way of storing grains in the early days. Third one. The dead people in Mehrgarh were buried with dash. A. Cows. B. Buffaloes. C. Goats. D. Dogs. What's the correct option? Yes. C. Goats. The dead people in Mehrgarh were buried with goats. Children, today we have completed the revision of history lesson number 2. We shall continue with the revision of another lesson in our next class. Till then, goodbye children.